My guest today is retired Major General Mick Ryan, strategist, author and globally recognised voice on modern warfare. Mick continues to shape the debate on leadership, innovation and the future of conflict. Today we're going to unpack his journey and his insights on what it means to navigate conflict today and prepare for tomorrow. Let's dive in. Welcome to the briefing room. Whether you're in defence, investing into the future, or simply curious about how great ideas become reality, this is your mission briefing. Let's get started. Mick Ryan, welcome to the Beaten Zone Ventures podcast.
Thanks, Pete. It's great to be with you.
Super excited to be able to ask you some questions. We hear a lot from you. You put out a lot of content, but I'm more interested in who is behind the Mick Ryan brand, what drives you. Can you give us a bit of an introduction to, first of all, yourself and what you're doing now?
Queenslander, proud Queenslander, go Broncos. Brought up in a little mining town in central Queensland, born in Mackay, so not a southern Queenslander, but a central Queenslander. Joined the Army at 17, did 35 years in the Army, retired at the start of 2022 because I felt it was just time to do something different. Mm-hmm. Still love the Army, still associated with many of the units and love that, just adore that association with the Australian Army. But, I have a bit of a portfolio. I'm a strategic advisor for a few different firms, and I'm sure we'll talk about those. I do a lot of writing, both books, reports, my Substack, articles, do a little bit of media and speaking, do a bit of teaching for different war colleges and organisations around the world, and I'm with Centre for Strategic and National Studies in DC as well as Lowy Institute in Sydney. So, it's a busy life, but every bit of my busyness is things I've chosen. Being your own boss and running your own business is pretty good, actually. And if your boss is bad, you just have to look at the mirror and have a harsh talk with yourself.
So leaving the Army, did you plan on going into business for yourself, or is that just something that evolved after being asked to do a few things?
No, probably won't surprise you that I'd started planning about 10 years.
Okay, so there was definite transition process for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I knew, I like to think of myself now as a strategist. Everyone leaves eventually. Some people don't get that until it's too late, but everyone leaves eventually. So I thought, well, you can leave smart or you can leave dumb. And I decided to try and leave smart. So, I did all the transition seminars. They are useful. And, started thinking about what I want to do. I engaged a transition coach. She was magnificent.
Mm-hmm. What does a transition coach do?
Well, a transition coach is all about guiding you on the journey from being institutionalised to not being institutionalised. The big first decision you make when you get out of the Army is, do you want to be owned or not? Which is essentially, do you want to run your own life or do you want to work for another big entity, a corporation, not-for-profit, whatever? My answer to that was, I don't want to be owned. I want to do my own thing. And then the second question you have to answer is, do you want to use what you've learnt over 4 decades or do you want to start from ground zero? So I thought, well, I want to be my own boss, but I want to use what I've learnt. So I worked with the transition coach, wrote a long essay about what I thought I was good at, what I'd like to do, showed it to my family. My wife and daughters thought some of it was good, some of it was...
harsh as critics.
Some of it, yes, they were quite harsh in some areas. But between us, we kind of walked between my family, my transition coach, a lady by the name of Kirsten Ferguson, who's just absolutely brilliant. And we worked out that a portfolio was probably right for me between the business, strategic advisory, writing, speaking, and other things. And that's what I've adhered to over the last 4 years. It's, I've evolved what I have in each bucket and what the proportion of work is in each bucket. But it was a pretty deliberate design. I had a 12-month plan when I got out. The war in Ukraine meant it was a 12-hour plan. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of how it all worked out. But, the best advice I could give to anyone leaving the military is leave happy.
Yes.
I left very happy and satisfied that I had deeply enjoyed my time in the Army, that I still adored it when I left. There may have been a couple of bosses I had that I may not have always got on well with, but the Army, I think, is a magnificent institution. I thought it when I was in it. I think it now. It falls short of those aspirations and values sometimes, but it's always trying to reach those high goals it sets for its values, its character, its behaviour and its performance.
So the difference between leaving happy or not happy, do you think that was part of the plan because you had one? Do you think when people leave dissatisfied or unhappy is either because something negative happened or they're not sure what to do next?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of reasons you can leave unhappy. Obviously, you can have a couple of bad experiences with people you work for, and, I've had them as well, but you need to put that in perspective. It's like just because you work for an idiot sometimes doesn't mean they're indicative of the entire institution, and my belief is generally they're not. But so that's one reason. Obviously family pressures can be an issue. I had 2 postings where I was separated from a family. I didn't really like that very much. It was part of the deal, but, we decided that we didn't want to continue doing that. So there's a whole range of reasons you might leave unhappy, and clearly we have a lot of veterans who have left because of medical reasons, and, we need to ensure we continue supporting them for the rest of their lives. So there's a whole range of reasons you can leave unhappy, but if you are prepared and you have a plan and you start early preparing, you can at least reduce the chances of leaving unhappy.
So the strategic advisory roles that you're now working on, we're lucky enough to have you at Beaton Zone Venture Partners as our advisor at large. Can you explain what sort of work that involves for you and how do you get to use all of the experience that you've gained in your long career in the Army now and apply that to other organisations? You can use some examples if you can speak about some of those.
Sure. Firstly, I'm very proud of my role with Beaton Zone. I think it's an awesome Australian company, and I think it's an exciting company, and I'd like to see the country, support more kind of VCs like this. But I love Beaton Zone and being a small part of the team. I'm an advisor for a couple of American companies, Skydio, Drones, the Special Competitive Studies Project, Useful Fiction, as well as Jane's in the UK. And all of these, they're not like a board role. That is a very specific, well-defined function, especially a lot of governance and all that kind of thing, short-term direction. Whereas strategic advisors, when they're used well, are more about challenging existing views within the leadership of a company. They're about looking at longer-term opportunities, not directions, that's what leaders and boards do, but opportunities.
Yes.
And thinking about, what are the issues on the flanks that we might not have thought about, as one of my brigade commanders used to talk about, leaders think about issues on the flanks.
Yes.
And I think that's what strategic advisors do. And, I do things like this, and happy to help out where Beaton Zone might be talking to other companies and provide updates on where the world is and where it might be going. So it's a kind of broad remit, and there's a certain amount of flexibility in a strategic advisory role that you don't always have in a board position, which, is very different.
It is different. And look, I can speak to the experience that we've had. For example, when you came and spoke at the event post coming back from Ukraine, you got to share your experience. Now, that wasn't anything to do with strategy as such, but it was more sharing your insights from someone who's been there with a level of depth and experience that was going to be knowledge and insight that we needed and we would benefit from our LPs listening to. So, yes, you're not delivering any sort of specific strategy, but your lived experience, your well-educated perspective was really valuable in that scenario. So I suppose you can combine the two, what you're currently doing. So you're not just talking about your previous experience of a long career, you're talking about your existing knowledge that you're still going out and acquiring, like you're still going and doing active missions as such.
And it's about, providing context to what's going on in the world, not what is happening, but why is that happening and what might that mean for Australian defence industry, for example, or military institutions. And so it's not so much about, guiding or influencing you and Steve and the team. It's just about, have you thought of this? Just kind of throwing out nuggets and bits of analysis that, help inform, future decision making.
And storytelling. That is, I would say you're a chief master of storytelling. You do that through writing, speaking, presenting, doing interviews like this. How do you think that helps influence innovation within defence? How powerful is the art of storytelling, do you think, in actually shifting perspectives? Well,
humans have always been storytellers. We were storytellers before anything else, even before we started drawing on cave walls or eventually, doing radio or pictures. We're storytellers at heart. And the most compelling way to get across purpose, to get across ideas, to get across what is happening is to tell a story. Now, I know I've been fortunate to know and work for a couple of people in my career who are just magnificent storytellers. I'm very average. There are some people I know who are just the most amazing communicators and storytellers, and hopefully one day I might be half as good as they are. But I think narratives are really important. It's why I wrote White Sun War. It's why I've written another novel and have just started on a sequel to White Sun War, because sometimes when it comes to defence and national security issues, the old non-fiction report or book with 1,000 footnotes isn't the right way to communicate with people, or it only communicates with a small audience. If you're trying to access a much larger proportion of your society and our community, sometimes narrative, sometimes storytelling is the best way to do that.
How did you learn to do that? I mean, you've been in the army since you were 17. You've left. Did you actually train yourself in the art of storytelling or content creation? Because you're learning as you go, like you said. You're getting feedback on what the length, the format, the style has the most impact or gets the message across. Is this something that you are continuously self-assessing, or have you actually gone and done some formal training around writing, content creation?
It's a combination of things. I guess the foundation is that I've always been a reader.
Right.
You can't tell stories if you haven't read a lot of stories. Good writers are readers, and if you read books by great writers like Stephen King, he talks about you can't be a good writer if you haven't read a lot. You can't tell good stories if you haven't read good stories. So I think that's part of it. I think Army's leadership training is about storytelling partially. I mean, good leaders communicate purpose. They communicate intent. That is storytelling. And it needs to be clear, it needs to be compelling, it needs to both influence and inspire people to do things they may not think they're capable of doing. So that's part of it. A third part is just doing it. I published my first article in 1999 in the Army Journal, which is actually about mechanised combat engineering. So it was exciting last week to go to Townsville and see Army's brand new, wonderful armoured engineering capability, just magnificent. So lots of writing. And then more recently I've been doing a PhD, which is largely compete on creative writing.
Right.
To be taught, sponsored by two amazing writers who are also academics at University of Queensland. Hello, Kim and Helen, who I've just learnt so much from. Yes. About the art of storytelling, about the art of writing. And so it's a combination of, doing it, learning from experts, reading, and what the Army teaches us in our training and education continuum.
So was doing a PhD in your transition plan originally?
Not really. I actually started it to look at Ukraine, but I ended up figuring out that I could write a book and publish it much more quickly without, I really wanted to learn, and I felt I wasn't learning the same amount in that as I was in writing. And Wilkins, who's an amazing professor out at UQ, came to me and said, well, why don't you come and do a creative writing PhD with me? You can write your next novel. There's an exegesis over the top of that. And, the PhD really is about how do we use historical military fiction that's well designed to prepare contemporary leaders. Because you need leadership that prepares them for technological environments, but you need stories that prepare them for a human environment. And I think historical military fiction has a role in that. So that's at heart my PhD, and I've written a novel which is about Australian soldiers in the 1980s doing some stuff to solve some mysteries from World War II. So we'll see how that goes. But I think it's really...
Based off some facts in there?
Lots of facts. Lots of facts in there. There may be some made-up stuff as well.
Some stuff, yeah, I bet. How do you feel putting your... Because a lot of what you put out is your opinion based off lived experience, strategy, storytelling. How do you feel putting your perspectives out there as if they should be instructions to follow? You've got entire government industry following guidance or suggestions that you put forward. Does that weigh on you as a sense of responsibility, or are you that confident in what you put forward and you're happy if people follow what your direction?
I was really nervous the first couple of articles I published because, I was worried, well, what if people don't like it?
Yes.
But you kind of have to rip the seal off and do it, rip that Band-Aid off, get it out there and realise, well, there's always going to be someone out there who doesn't like what you say or what you write. That's just part of being a human. But there will be people out there who respond to it. Either they want to engage you about it, or that might provoke some different thoughts for them, or might lead them to research something else they might not have otherwise looked at. So there is a responsibility. Everything I write is evidence-based, either based on my real experience or real research or real on-the-ground experience in different places. So there is a responsibility to get it right, be truthful, don't make stuff up, unless it's, a fictional novel, then you can make up all the stuff you want. But, generally if I'm writing an op-ed or an article, it's evidence-based. I don't feel that, people have to follow what I'm saying. It's just like, well, this is an idea. I want to still serve my country, and the way I feel I can do that is put ideas into the discourse. You can either grab them or not. I'm not losing any sleep over which way, but I just want to at least have my say and make a contribution.
So you've been called a war strategist before. Where does that come from?
That's probably one of the more polite things I've been called. No, I mean, I have a lot of training and education in this, right? I've got 3 master's degrees in military studies, operational studies, and international public policy. I've worked as a strategist in military strategy, military strategic planning, done a lot of work for the CDF here, worked as a strategist for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the Pentagon. So I've got both the education and the experience at the strategic and the interface of the strategic political levels to, I guess, at least be able to knowledgeably talk about strategies for war. I think a lot of people get a bit confused when they think about war, they think about military. I don't. Wars are not military affairs. Wars are national affairs. Military campaigns are military things, but wars are much larger. They're much more complex, and they involve the entirety of society. So that's the approach I take in learning about war, in learning about the Ukraine war. It's not just the military endeavours, it's a societal endeavour. There's politics, there's emergency services, there's communities, there's kids, there's old people. So when I think about war, that's how I conceive of it. It is a much broader thing than just military activities.
It's a really interesting perspective. I don't think the general public quite grasps it as you've just explained that, which sort of brings me back to your role as connecting military, government, industry and the public. And how do you see your role and how do you play in that space to help bring those together? And yes, it's going to be content, but there's probably more to it than that.
Yep. I guess I'll go back to 2010. I was sent at very short notice to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on Afghanistan-Pakistan issues. And there was a whole bunch of things I did there for 2 years. But one of the things I used to do regularly with my colleagues was brief members of Congress and their staffers. And we'd do that, half a dozen times a week. There was a lot of engagement, and there was a lot of engagement with the media. And the Americans have a very different and more mature relationship with their media and with their legislators. It was not controversial for mid-ranking officers to go brief legislators on different elements of what was going on or talk to the media. And I thought, well, there's something in this. We can be better at this, because we can't afford to have this defensive crouch that the Department of Defence and the ADF has in dealing with Parliament and with the media. We need to be more engaged so we can not influence them but make sure they're better informed. And from that I really learnt that, you have to lean into this. And in some respects, I do a lot of this because Defence isn't doing enough of it. I think we should be better at informing the Australian people and our legislators and the media about what we do, why we do it, but also the amazing things we do every day. We have tens of thousands of amazing young and not so young Australians out there every day in our region, in our community, and we could be better at showing them off. So I feel a responsibility to help with that process of make sure that, the connectivity between the military and government, military and people is stronger than ever, because that's what good democracies do.
Going back to your earlier years in the army, what did leading younger soldiers teach you about leadership, and how did that shape you becoming the leader that you ended up becoming?
Yeah, I think Duntroon gave us a pretty good foundation. You know, we were trained by warrant officers and senior officers who had all done time in Vietnam. And, you know, the leadership doctrine was based on the experiences of our leaders in combat in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. So we got a pretty good foundation, but you still didn't really know the Army when you jumped into it from the training institution. And frankly, I think most of us, when we leave Duntroon, are pretty average leaders because we've never done it.
No.
And you really are starting to learn. And, you know, if I was to give myself a score as a young troop leader of combat engineers, probably 5 out of 10. I wouldn't rate myself any higher than that because we're still learning. We were inexperienced, you know, and sometimes you just didn't have the right priorities to look after all those you were leading. The key thing was just to remain open to listening to people, listening to senior NCOs, learning about leadership. And sometimes I was good at that, sometimes probably wasn't. I think I'm probably far more humble now than I was back then. You know, there's not too many really humble young 21-year-old boys in society,
right?
This
is true.
That's just unfortunately part of being a 21-year-old boy. There are many reasons why that is. I'm not going to get into all those, but sometimes it's not great for being humble about learning and stuff. As you mature, you get better. I think I got better at it. I certainly had a lot of different experiences with leadership in our army, but also, you know, in Iraq with the Americans, in the Pentagon and places like that. And it kind of rounds you out, and you deal with not just army, but the other services, with other countries, with politicians, with the media, and it all kind of adds up to a bunch of different experiences. Yeah, it's like compound interest, right? It's compound leadership, and you learn and hopefully you get better at it.
And in saying that, you learned through your own lived experience, but who was the most influential person in your career in terms of who did you look to as a leader that you either liked their style or said something to you that stuck? Is there someone that stands out?
I mean, I had some average leaders. I've had a couple of not so great ones, but I have had some truly great ones. I think General Frank Hickling, I worked for him in 1998. I thought he was just amazing as a very humble, smart general who became Chief of the Army, who demonstrated moral courage. You know, he went and spoke to the National Press Club about the problems with the Army without telling the minister. That took a lot of courage, and it was the right thing to do. And it was, you know, he explained to me one time he was on the border in Lebanon watching a Scandinavian battalion on patrol, and they had no magazines on their weapons. And he said, "Why is that?" And they said, "Oh, we had an unlawful discharge, so our magazines are in our packs." And he said there and then he decided, we are not going to be that army. We need to be better focused on soldiering, war fighting, not the peacekeeping stuff that dumbs us down. And that it was he that really launched the reinvigoration of the Australian Army. Now, it was still an ongoing process when we went into East Timor, and I think General Peter Lay then took up that for 6 years as Chief of Army and really ran with it in Hardened Network Army. But I thought it was General Hickling that modernised us, put out the first modern doctrine, Fundamentals of Land Warfare. So I really admire him. The other person, among many others, but I deeply admired General Martin Dempsey, who I got to work for directly in Iraq. I thought he was probably the best leader I've ever worked for.
Why was that?
Humility, clear purpose, got out of the way once he'd given you direction, never focused the attention on himself, very approachable, very smart, and a great singer. And, you know, the one book I recommend on leadership for everyone is a book called No Time for Spectators, which is written by him, but it's basically a series of chapters of where he stuffed up as an officer.
So he's done his own self-reflection and then captured it in his own
and
book.
what he learned from failures or other things. So I was very fortunate to work for people like that. I also had some great leaders in the Army here. You know, I had some great leaders when I worked in the Pentagon. You know, Ben Hodges, who's probably well known to many of your listeners, was my boss, and we're still friends. And I saw him in the UK recently, just a great leader, great human, great soldier. So I've been very lucky to have some exemplars sort of allowed me to look at them and then look at myself in the mirror and go, you can be better.
It seems like it's a common strategy that leaders who are at that calibre are the ones who've been able to look back at their own performance, assess it, reflect on it, share it, whether good, bad or otherwise. And you seem to be doing the same thing, even in your writing. Like you said, learning as you go, looking back, doing some self-reflection.
Yeah, you never stop. The people I didn't mention when I talk about leadership was my peers.
Yes.
All through your career, you're doing these courses as a captain, as a major, in the army, at Quantico with the Marines. And there were often times you looked at your peers and went, holy moly, I wish I was that good. They are sickeningly competent and talented. And I was very fortunate to work with people like that. And, for example, my staff college class, my school events warfighting class from Quantico from 23, 24 years ago, we're still all in touch. In fact, I just saw a couple of my classmates in Hawaii recently who's a 2-star, now to be a 3-star. Another became Chief of Defence in Canada. So the peer examples I was exposed to, I'm not sure I provided much of an example to them, but there were people I had the pleasure to get to know as friends and classmates that, I looked at and went, holy moly, that is a great person. That is why that person is, for example, I don't know, Chief of Army now.
Yes.
Because you looked at them and sometimes they might have even been junior to you. That person is the real deal. And we've had a few of them in our army, thank goodness.
Oh, look, I'm sure people would look back at you now, and because not everyone, they might be able to do well inside in an institution environment, but to be able to transition out and thrive there and succeed in a way that you have can be something that other people find challenging as well. So I think it's all to do with the context of it and looking at it from that perspective as well.
And just giving it a go.
Giving it a go, having a go. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about Ukraine. You've written extensively about Ukraine. What do you see as some of the key lessons that we can take away, or anyone who's listening can take away from Ukraine and what's happening?
Well, I guess there's a bunch of political lessons. The first one is that politicians need to understand that war is possible in the 21st century, that we can't fall for the old myth that just because we trade with each other doesn't mean we mightn't fight with each other. That theory prevailed before the First World War, didn't work out. It was a theory in Europe in 2021, did not work out, and it could have the same thing in our region. So we need to understand that war is always possible, and for that reason you need to invest in deterring it. Obviously you want to win it if you're in it, but it's always better to deter it. And an ounce of deterrence is better than a ton of war. So I think that's an important political lesson. And for that, our politicians need to be better educated. And
how do we educate them?
Well, I think they need to listen to experts more, not to young advisors who are in the 24/7 Twitter fight. There's more to their responsibilities than that. They need to look beyond the media cycle, to be more strategic, look beyond the next election. I know that sounds hard, but I think that's how you need to think about your responsibilities as a politician, particularly at the federal level, but state level has a responsibility here as well. So I think there's a whole bunch of political lessons. There's lessons about information, I think, that are really important, that we are in an era where, some call it a post-truth era. I'm not sure whether that's the right discussion, but we're in a very different era of information. Firstly, over the last 20 years, we've seen everyone have better access to information. And I think politicians are still challenged by this. 25 years ago, most citizens didn't have the access to an array of data and information they have now to make decisions about who they vote for. That, I think, is still challenging political models, but it's also allowing malign actors to manipulate. And some of those are adversary nations, some of those are criminals, some are just bad people in our society that want to break down societal cohesion. We've seen that manifest and accelerate through Ukraine in a good way. They've got their story out there. You've got to not just win a war, you've got to win the story of a war. And I think that's an important insight. But you've seen Russia do everything it can to break down the cohesion of NATO, break down the cohesion of Ukraine and other countries. Two other lessons, I guess, the acceleration of uncrewed systems. No, this is not new. We saw them in World War II in Europe. We saw them in our region. The first FPV drones were used by the US Navy in our region in the Second World War. People forget that these are things that have been around for a long time, but no one expected this huge acceleration, an explosion in the use initially of uncrewed aerial systems, but now ground and maritime systems that are transforming how we think about organising and fighting in military campaigns. They don't replace humans. I think that is a myth. What they do is extend the capacity of humans in every endeavour, whether it is surveillance, warfighting, casualty evacuation, resupply, a whole range of things. So they don't replace. They might pull humans a little bit back from threats. They don't replace us, because when you replace humans in war, it's not war anymore. It becomes a technological interaction. I guess the final lesson of many is about leadership. Good leadership matters. Individuals can make a difference. And I think that's a really important lesson, not just for politicians, but for everyone. You can make a difference, whether it's in your community at the footy club, whether it's at the Rotary, whether it's as a military leader, whether it's a politician at the local, state or federal level. You can make a difference. But to do that, you've got to, be collaborative. You've got to have good messages. You've got to be able to demonstrate purpose and the ability to communicate with people. That's what Zelensky's done. That's what many of his military leaders have done from top to bottom. It's what many of his civilian leaders in different towns and cities across Ukraine have done. So I think it's a wonderful case study of just the importance of leadership.
It's interesting because there is a lot of focus on the tech and technology and innovation around war. So my question around, I think you've just answered it, but mate, let's just reiterate the fact that when does technology fundamentally change a war and when doesn't it? How do we navigate the next phase where we have so much new tech coming in, yet we still need to focus on what you just spoke about, which is the humans within this entire scenario and the leadership that's going to influence what we do next?
Yep. I mean, technology's been part of war from the time the first caveman picked up the rock and threw it at the head of his friend, right? Whether it's the stirrup or the longbow or battleships in the late 19th, early 20th century, aircraft in the start of the 20th century, nuclear weapons, AI and autonomous systems now. Technology has always played a role. It's always influenced war. But technology's always been designed and used by humans. And technology in and of itself is insufficient. You need to ensure it's combined with humans in the right way, in the right organisations, using the right ideas for its employment. So, new technology, new ideas, new organisations, kind of the trilogy of things you need to get right, whether it's for the longbow or AI in military organisations. So that is not new. We just have to have the discipline to do it and have the intellectual discipline to understand that just because someone says, give me some of that AI, it's going to fundamentally shift how you do things. There's a lot more to it than that. I guess the other lesson of technology, as important as it is, none of them provide us with a silver bullet. There's no singular technology that is going to be, that will win us the war. There'll be lots of different technologies with lots of ideas and lots of humans that do that. And they do it as a nation, not just as a military organisation.
Who's winning currently? Not the war, but this development or the pace or the innovation race around technology in this sector for war. Who's leading?
Well, I think the Ukrainians are. I mean, they've demonstrated this creative spirit from day one of the war that has just continued being systematised, not just in the military, but in their society with crowdfunding, organisations like Brave One and Come Back Alive, critical to that. So the creativity linking military with society and innovators and industry, I think, has been really important in this war. A lot Australia can learn from that.
Have you spoken to anybody, as far as the government, about the Brave One marketplace and that concept, and what has been the reception?
I think there's a sense that, we're already doing that. And it's like, no, we're not. We're buying a small number of extraordinarily exquisite uncrewed systems. That is not the approach the Ukrainians have taken. We do need some exquisite things. An F-35 is exquisite, expensive, and extraordinarily central to how we're going to fight in the future. But we also need the other end of things. So not only every member of our organisation have access, say, to digital command and control or have drones, but they can learn and iterate more quickly, which you can't do with expensive exquisite, but you can do with cheap and plentiful. So the Ukrainians have mastered that. I think what they've also mastered is learning how to learn. They've learned how to learn better. And every time I go back, I ask the question about, well, what are your processes for learning, for analysing lessons, for sharing them, getting them up the chain? And every time I go back, they have better answers for that. And
so are they creating industries as they go to facilitate this entire learning?
Pretty much. I mean, in
journey?
fact, the Ukrainian digital command and control system, which every soldier has access to, we don't do that. We should, but every soldier has access to it. There's now an app in it now where you can provide an idea to industry direct. Doesn't go through the chain of command, just boom, goes in. If you've got a good idea, you see a need, it goes in. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to act on it straight away, but
you have an opportunity to put an idea forward.
That's right. It's building a corpus of knowledge in industry about battlefield requirements now, not what they were 3 months ago. So they're the kind of things I think we need to be cleverer at. Our soldiers having a good idea is not a threat to the procurement agencies or to politicians. But that's how we act. That's how our systems, that's how our risk aversion culture is set up. Our soldiers are not a threat. They're an opportunity. They're full of good ideas. We need to use them more in coming up with future ways of thinking, fighting, organising ourselves.
Which leads me to founders of high-growth technology companies or anyone coming up with solutions in this space. Sometimes some of those founders are not from defence, yet they might have the perfect technology or idea or capability and capacity to build something and then sell it to defence. How do you recommend or suggest, knowing what you know from the inside and how defence works and the procurement process, how do you advise or suggest the founders get involved to either sit closer to the problems, get plugged into the network, or perhaps even start to get their ideas across so they can be heard from the outside coming in?
I guess start with have a clear view in your mind what you're trying to do and why you're doing it. I mean, I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Palmer Luckey about 18 months ago, and I said, well, how did you get into this gig?
A whole bunch of money?
But it wasn't just the money. It was like he wasn't from a background where the military was where he was at. He was fighting with himself a little bit, and he said, but killing people, doing defence stuff is immoral. And then he had this insight that was that might be immoral, but not defending your own people from those who want to do it to you is even more immoral. And that was, he said, kind of the breakthrough moment for him that, of course, killing's immoral. No one
doing
wants to
nothing
kill,
about it.
But doing
is
nothing
worse.
about it is worse. So I think we need more people, especially in ESG-related fields in Australia, to kind of have that insight that, yes, no one thinks killing's great, but not defending your country is worse. So have a clear purpose in why you want to do it. And then secondly, be very humble and listen. Listen to people. Listen to people's requirements. Don't listen to their processes, because we all know the processes in defence for getting stuff are crazy, but listen to the needs. And then probably come back with a solution, real solutions, not some theoretical AI drawing, but a proper solution that's feasible, deliverable at a reasonable price quickly and can be iterated. So, I mean, that's what we need to do. And not every technology is for killing, right? There are some technologies that might help us manage battlefield casualties better.
That's right, survivability.
Or manage blood supplies, for example, or be better at making sure we can distribute resupply better, or help with training, either in the system or a learning assistance for humans. So there's a whole bunch of different technologies that might be inserted where people can help us that don't just involve right at the tip of the spear.
How do you find, and why do you think it is that the media, for example, or coverage or general public perception always focuses on the killing part, opposed, especially in defence innovation? There is so much dedicated towards the survivability and, like you said, might be logistics, resupply, those kinds of things, but they don't tend to, they're not as fun to talk about, I suppose, yet they're vital for our survival.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the reasons is, if you're a mum and dad and one of your kids or your husband or partner or wife is going into the military, you want to make sure they're protected. So you have an interest in things that make sure if they have to go do the job, it's the other guy's going to be dead, not their relative. So I can understand that interest in ensuring we're looking after our people, and we should look after our people. There's a very pragmatic as well as a moral imperative to make sure we do that, not just in wartime, but every day of the year in military organisations. But sometimes we're just not good at explaining all the different things that we do. Blowing up stuff is a lot of fun. I know I've done a lot of it. It is cool. It's a lot of fun. I was up with the 3rd Brigade in Townsville doing that last week, and it's awesome. But there's a whole bunch of other really cool things our people do, and we're just not very good at sharing their stories sometimes because someone in a cubicle in Canberra decides that's not a cool story when, if you're working in, say, a health battalion in Brisbane or a training institution in Melbourne or something similar like that, a fires brigade in Adelaide, what you do is crucial. It's a really interesting endeavour, and the people have very interesting stories who are doing it. So I just think we need to be better at telling our stories. Sometimes traditional media can be used for that, but we can't saturate them. I think we need to be better at utilising social media. We've constricted that in recent years. We need to expand back out and use social media more to tell our stories. Because I got to tell you, I visit a lot of military units and I'm constantly inspired by the young people I see. They're way better than we were. They're fitter, they're smarter.
But they have access to more information than previous generations did at that age.
Yeah.
So they're open.
But they don't have access to telling people their stories.
No, they do
and
not.
And that's
There's
the one
a gap.
thing they don't have.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a risk aversion in our politicians in particular and some of our public servants to not allow that, which I find kind of ironic. We'll, allow a battalion commander to take 1,000 young men and women and some not so young women with an armoured battle group to Philippines for a couple of months and all the kind of live firing and dangerous cool stuff we do without a problem. But they won't let them do this with an iPhone. And it kind of confuses me because we're in an information war.
Yes.
Constantly, and we need everyone off the bench to help us with that, not just a few people sitting in Russell offices.
And that does mean giving them access to tech to be able to come up with solutions, not just always on the
Well, they all have access to it, right? It's just allowing them to use it cleverly.
Yes.
And I think the evidence from Ukraine says that the vast majority of people use it responsibly because they know they need to protect the operational security of their unit. They know that better than someone sitting in a cubicle in Canberra, right? They have a greater sense of responsibility to their organisation than any public servant, in a cubicle does. So just trust them. And I remember talking to the head of PR in the Ukrainian military at one point, explaining how they allow the brigades to do a whole lot of stuff themselves, and they do. And then I explained how we do it in the Australian Department of Defence, and he just looked at me and went, well, that won't work. So, I know there's many well-intentioned people in there, but we just need to catch up with the world. And
how's it going to shift? How are we actually going to catch up with the rest of the world?
I don't see an imperative there to do it at the moment.
Okay.
There doesn't seem to be one from the government. They just want to roll out a minister to talk about everything. Most people being what they are, they just turn off. But when you have a young, engaging Army lieutenant or, female Air Force corporal or male or female Navy petty officer talking about what they're doing, that's engaging. More of that, please.
Yes.
Because they're real people doing real things. They're from real families from all around this great country. More of them, please.
Because I hear a lot of we should do this, or they need to do this, or the Defence Force needs to do that, or we should learn from them. But there's a lot of the shoulds or need tos, but not a lot of when is it, how, and who is going to do all of those things.
Yeah.
At what point do we then say we have changed and we are doing?
Well, I think a lot of this is just remove barriers. People will do things. It's amazing the innovation that's out there. When I became a brigade commander, I just said, we're all going to be on social media. All your battalions are going to be on there.
Is that what it takes? An individual like yourself who just makes the decision?
Yeah.
And says, this is what we're doing now.
We're going to do it.
So what if there are some younger people still in Defence Force now who might rise up through the ranks in various leadership positions, will it take their boldness or being brave or courage to just make a decision to change along the way? Can you do that?
Yeah, you can. That's partially it. But partially it's you actually have a lot of authorities as a military leader that sometimes people don't exercise.
Why don't they?
Because there's this risk aversion that comes down from politics and from society in some respects. And my view is if you have an authority, never ask to use it. Tell people you've done it. But if you have the authority to act, just act. And I think sometimes some of the administrative processes, some of the risk management processes give people the impression that they can't act when they have the authorities to do that. And, I used to use the example of workplace health and safety legislation. A lot of people use it to minimise risk. And my view with my brigade was that's not what it's for. It's to maximise risk safely. And I even had WHS people come and say, is that right? And they go, yes, it is. But why don't more people think like that? But if you maximise risk safely, you get better return on investment for your training dollars. You get leaders forced to make harder decisions, which builds better leaders. And you're developing more realistic environments in which people will have to operate. So a lot of the time, the legislative framework is already there. We just have to nurture people to actually use that framework. Now, that's not to say there aren't a whole lot of suppressive obstacles to people doing that for innovation, whether it's lack of money or, continuing to transfer money into nuclear submarines when, a bit of money might help Army or Air Force to have even more innovation. But I think sometimes we just have to be better at using the authorities we've got.
Interesting. Now, you touched on it before, earlier in the conversation around the cost to family as a life of service and across defence, writing and some of your advisory roles. Has there been any other costs to you personally living this life that you have led?
Yeah, there's a cost. You don't get to see extended family as much. There's a cost to stability. When you're moving kids every couple of years, that's tough. Now, it's not as tough when they're in, say, preschool or primary school. In some respects, that's good because they get to see different things. Once they get to high school, it's a different game. Stability in high school because of the educational, but just because of where they are in their intellectual development and social development, stability's really, really important. And, we made a choice to settle in one place, and I would have, go to Darwin or Sydney for postings while my family stayed there. But, I missed key bits for my daughters, in that time period. So the fact that we've remained close and, they're physically close to us and we spend a lot of time with them is really good. When my daughters left home, my wife wasn't like happy, but I was really sad because I wanted more time with them, whereas she said, I spent all that time with them,
It happens really quickly too.
Yeah, it happens too quickly. But, fortunately we still see them a huge amount, and I don't think it's had a major impact, but you feel it. And I felt it at the time, and I still feel that I miss things there. There's the cost of there's always a proportion of people that just want to shoot at you.
Yes.
That's what happens. And, that's happened to me a few times and can be a little uncomfortable, but it's also part of the deal when you're leading large organisations. You're never going to have 100% of people on board cheerleading for what you're doing. That's just... I think human experience shows that that's just an impossibility.
So we take away the rank, close the lid of the laptop, take away Substack, the books. Who's Mick?
I'm not that different. When I was at the War College, I never even wore uniform because I didn't want my rank to get in the way of the interaction with students. And for me, a Major General is what I was, not who I was. Sometimes people get confused about that.
Yes, that's a big
Sometimes
big
people get confused themselves. But for me, the rank was just what happened and allowed me to do what I needed to do as a leader. It wasn't an I didn't aspire to rank. I aspired to have responsibility and authorities that hopefully would make the Army or bits of the Army better. Not everyone is like that, unfortunately, but a lot of people are. And we have a lot of very fine leaders in the Army. But who am I? Well, I'm a Queenslander. Pretty simple guy, love reading, love science fiction, love spending time with my family, love peace and quiet, love going to the movies, that kind of stuff. And I'm just a very simple, uncomplicated person who likes to read, who likes to write. Don't like travel as much as I used to, although I still do a lot of it. And I like spending time with my family.
Is there anything interesting that people would be really surprised to hear?
Not really.
No, you're pretty straightforward.
No,
That's it.
I don't think so. I have cats, I like cats. I follow the Broncos. I love Test cricket. I'm a pretty normal, boring person.
Normal, boring. I don't think anyone, maybe you think it's boring, but I think everyone else probably thinks it's very interesting. And delving into all of your content, it's no surprises there as to why. But if you were to go back now into the ADF with everything that you know, what area would you go into and why?
I'd probably sit down with the Chief of Army, who I admire deeply. I think is doing a wonderful job of leading the Army through a difficult period, in the global environment, but also in a budgetary environment. I'd probably sit down with him and say, well, let me set up a drone command. I think we probably need to do that just to force these things in and, set up a whole range of organisations using reservists to start off with and then gradually fill it out with regulars. That would be one thing I think is interesting. We really are behind in this and we need to force it and we need an advocate who can punch it through. Another one might be at a higher level and go, well, who's going to look after mobilisation of the Australian Defence Force?
Yep.
We're going to have to do that at some point in the next decade. Even if it's just a limited expansion, somehow we're going to have to get more people through the door. We're going to have to train them more quickly than we ever have. We have to deploy them in different ways than we ever had. So that's something that really interests me. I think, how do you mobilise the military within a national mobilisation construct? Because remember, militaries actually don't mobilise, countries do. And countries mobilise to help the expansion of the military, expansion of industry, the expansion of the relationship between society and the military. So I think that's would be an interesting endeavour as well. But, sometimes I think might be some senior people there think, oh, not Ryan. So, and I can understand that. I can understand that view as well.
There's so many younger founders out there working on solutions that they think is going to be useful or needed. You see a lot of tech, you see a lot of solutions in the market which are doing well, ones that aren't doing so well. Is there anything that you see a massive gaping hole where if anyone was going to be building something or applying their knowledge and skills towards an area within tech that can be utilised in the defence market or the defence sector, what would you say would be your number one area to focus?
I mean, these are two areas I think where there are some good Australian companies, but we need to do more. I think, firstly, Australian developed AI for decision support.
For decision support? Okay.
In military organisations. The Americans are moving out with this. And
can you explain that a little bit?
The use of AI to support decision making, okay. So agentic planning tools,
yes,
developing options, simulation, these kind of things for intelligence, target development, for workforce planning, for logistics support, for kill chains, for medical live chains. There's probably an inclination just to go with what the Americans got. And I understand that. But also we need to ensure the AI is encoded with what we think as Australians. Australia and America, we're allies. We share some values, but not all of them. We're different. And I'd love to see more Australian Indigenous artificial intelligence development that's about supporting good decision-making by leaders at different levels, not big SAP imported stuff, which is really just a corporate governance thing. So I think I'd love to see that. I'd love to see every member of the Defence Force have situational awareness on this, like the Ukrainians have. And if you talk to their digital transformation people, it's been a journey. There's a whole lot of security issues. There's constant patching, but there's geofencing and stuff. That would give all our people a better level of situational awareness about what's going on, but also to update situational awareness. And the Ukrainians are so far ahead of us in this. I think it's amazing. And I know I said two, but one final one, counter-drone, I think is extraordinarily important. There are a couple of good companies in Australia who are doing this. I know one in Melbourne who's doing the laser defence stuff, extraordinarily impressive. But I think, cheap, low cost but highly effective drone defences for critical infrastructure, major events, major military bases is crucial now. We are very vulnerable to a spiderweb type event and we have no way to prevent that. People say, well, we can shoot down drones with F-35s. It's like, so every base has an F-35 over it 24/7 to shoot down 5 DJI Mavics with a bit of explosive on. No. So, we need to have better, cheaper, 24/7 drone defences because I think we're extraordinarily vulnerable. And this is the kind of country that can develop that. We just need a kind of Department of Defence that's willing to listen and allow Australian companies to innovate, iterate and deploy this quickly.
If they were to listen and then innovate and deploy, how quickly could we be in a better position than we are now?
There are systems out there right now.
Okay.
The Ukrainians have iterated drone defences over the last 4 years. And I've spoken to their air defence, the physicists who come up with a lot of this stuff. They have developed low-cost drone defences that are much cheaper than the drones they're shooting down. The Ukrainians have just deployed people to Denmark to help them with their drone problem. The Russians are clearly probing Scandinavian countries. that could very easily happen to us. But a criminal gang could do it as well. So there
But
are
timeframes, if we could say within 6 months, could we be in a better position if the Defence Force were to listen and act now?
Yes, absolutely. The Ukrainians have now changed the law where they can export this kind of technology. That was not the case until recently, but they're changing their legislation so this kind of stuff can be exported. And there are a bunch of small Ukrainian industries that, Australian companies could partner with to, get the IP, import it and build this stuff in Australia. We need Indigenous solutions because if there is some kind of conflict, we will go to the back of the line with the Americans, the Brits, the Japanese and everyone else. The only way we'll get priority is if we build this stuff ourselves. That's what happened in the Pacific War. It's what happened often during the Iraq War with things like night vision goggles. We need to make sure we're prepared in case the Allies go, you're at the back of the line for this stuff.
I'm going to leave it there on that note. It's been an insightful conversation, which I knew it would be. Thank you so much for your time, Mick. I really appreciate all of the insights that you have shared with us. And I think it's actually quite hopeful. I think we've ended on a hopeful note because you always highlight what's possible.
And I'm a big believer in Australian industry, Australian defence industry. We've got some extraordinarily clever physicists, engineers, manufacturing people in this country. Let's double down and invest in them more than what we already are.
100% agree. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for joining us in the briefing room. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with the people shaping our national security and future capability. If you liked what you heard, please follow the show, share it with a friend, and join us next time for more stories and insights from the front lines of innovation. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep building the future.